When I was a brand new real estate investor, I learned that if I didn't have the money to buy a good real estate deal, someone else would. That someone else was a partner. But how do you structure a partnership? And how do you find those people with the money? And how do you make sure you don't end up with the wrong partner who starts off great and then turns into a nightmare? Well, all of those questions and more are what I'm covering in this episode with my special guest and my mentor, John Schaub. And we're getting started right now. Welcome to the podcast, Real Estate Investing with Coach Carson. I'm your host, Chad Carson. You can also call me Coach Carson, and this is a show to help you get out of the financial grind so you can spend your time doing more of what matters. And now let's get to my interview with a real estate investor who's successfully used partnerships for over 5 decades in his rental property business, John Schaub.
One of the topics that I'm hearing a lot lately is that people get into rental property investing. They understand the benefits. They've got 1 or 2 properties, and then they run out of money. They have no money left, and they still want to follow your advice of at least buying 1 property per year, but they're sort of stuck on this idea that I might have to wait 2 or 3, 4 years to save up enough cash to do it. Something that I learned from you early on was to use partners, use other people's money. And I know you've done that a lot in your career. I was wondering if we could go just tell a little story, go back, because a lot of people hear your story and you're many decades into your investing. But when you first started or early in your career, when you ran out of money or you didn't have the money to invest, I'm curious how you could tell people how that worked and what it was like for you at that point as the entrepreneur trying to go out and buy properties.
Yeah. Well, I think like most people, when I first started, I thought what I would be able to do is go down to the bank and borrow some money to buy a house. And I tried that, but it didn't work. My income wasn't high enough. I was selling real estate. I was making some money, but they don't like commission income. They like to see a salary, a W-2 form that shows you get paid so much every week. And I didn't have that. And also I was finding deals that the banks didn't like. They're pretty particular about what they'll lend against. And, if you find a house that needs a lot of work, they really don't want to make that loan because what they have is a house they can't sell to somebody else. So there's a number of reasons that I could not borrow from banks. So I would look for deals. And the first fellow I invested with had made money in real estate. And I think that's probably a key to this operation is you don't want to try to invest with somebody who's never owned any real estate. If they just won the lottery or if they've been in the stock market or just inherited a bunch of money, they may want to invest with you, but you should be careful about who you invest with. It's real important. A couple of things. Number one is whoever you're investing with is honest. Is on the same page you are as far as your business ethics. But just as important probably is their plan. Do they want to hold something for a long time, or they expect you to buy it and sell it and make a profit in 6 months and give them their money back? And sometimes things change. Sometimes people say they want to be in for a long time, and then 6 months later they need the money back. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But going in, if you're going to be an investor, in my mind, an investor is different than a flipper. A flipper is somebody who tries to make money short term. And I'm not against that. That's just not what I do. It's more work than I want to do. I prefer to buy something and hold it for a long time and manage it. Now, management takes a little time, but not nearly as much time as fixing a house up and reselling it. So I'm a long-term fella. I'm a long-term investor, and I haven't always been, but I have been for the last 40 years. And so I'm looking for somebody to pair up with when I take money from somebody who also has that long-term outlook, because you don't want to be forced to sell something in a certain period of time. So 2 things that are real important. Number one is you don't set a time period. You don't say we're going to sell it in 3 years or 5 years or even 10 years, because you don't know what the economy is going to be like then. And so a lot of things change. So you're better, if you're going to have a goal of any kind, have a goal of how much profit you're going to make. So I like to tell people that we're going to hold something until it doubles in value. And then we can rethink it. We can decide whether to keep it longer or to sell it. Because if today we were buying houses probably in about round figures 300 to 400 range. So if we had a house that we bought for 300 and it doubled in value, we'd have a $300,000 profit to share. So that's significant, but it's so much different than trying to flip something short term.
Right. So it's more.
So the long.
Oh yeah, I like the simplicity of that idea that. And it was one of the questions I was going to get to is you partner with someone. Sometimes there's these expectations that I'm going to make a 10% return, or I'm going to make a 20% return. And what I'm hearing you say is trying to first set the expectation to be patient, or be more patient. I'm a long-term investor. If you want to invest with me, we need a line on the timetable that we're talking about here. We're buy and hold investors, making money over the long run. And number two, setting a goal for an amount of profit instead of a timeline. So it might be 5 years, it might be 20 years. We just have to be patient here to get that profit.
Mm-hmm. And to the point you just brought up, you never want to guarantee somebody a profit. And the problem the flippers have sometimes is when they borrow money from somebody, they're in effect guaranteeing somebody a return. If they borrow money at 12%, the people who lend them the money are expecting their 12%.
Right.
And that doesn't always work
right.
out. So don't talk about percentages. Don't talk about rates of return. Talk about holding things for a period of time and without putting a number on it, and talk about the amount of profit. And I think doubling, in my books and in my classes, I've always kind of taught that concept to hold something until it doubles. And I've held houses till they've doubled 3 or 4 times. So if you hold them long enough, your profit gets pretty dramatic after a while. And I will tell you, I haven't had in my whole career, I've only had 4 or 5 investors. So it's not like I'm looking for dozens of people to invest with. And so another important point I think is when you're looking for somebody, and let's just get back to how you even start before you start looking for somebody. You need to have a deal. I've always found that if I have a contract to buy something with a relatively short-term closing, say 30 days or 60 days, and I have to go out and find some money or I can't close that gives me something very real to talk about. It's a house I can take somebody out and show and say, yeah, we can buy this house. It's worth $350 and we can buy it for $325 or $300. And the sellers have agreed to carry financing. So what I need is $50,000 down. And we can talk real numbers, and people will make a decision when they have a real deal a lot easier than if it's kind of a maybe deal. Like if I could find a house, would you put up the money? Well, that's just a conversation, because if you find a house, they may not put up the money. So it's better to go shopping with a contract in your hand for investors. And probably most people listening to this conversation know somebody who likes to invest in real estate. And if you don't, you need to make some new friends. I've always kidded, if you're 25 years old and looking for money, you don't look with your friends, because most 25-year-olds don't have any money. You need to ramp, you need to go up a couple generations. Yeah. And when I look back at it, Fred, my first investor, he was retired and I was 25. So he was 40 years older than I was. And if somebody's 40 years older than you are and they've invested in real estate, they probably have some money, and if they don't have any money, that's a bad sign.
My first
first
investor was named Dr. Stone. He's still a friend and investor with me, but he used to call me the young pup, and he was the old lion. And it was the same kind of situation where he said, but to your point, just to kind of talk about the profile of a good investor, he was an existing investor. He had developed properties. He owned rental properties. He flipped houses. He was just, I call this like the lazy money stage. He was like, I don't really want to do all the work that you're doing, Chad. So if you bring me a deal, I asked him that exact question. I said, if I bring you a deal that looks like this, and I want to talk about what this looks like, then would you be willing to put up the money? And he said, yeah, let's do it. We'll figure out a way. And it was really, I was shocked how simple the conversation was, because I thought it'd be a long drawn out thing. It was more like, we're on a walk. I had a conversation. And I want to ask about that, because you said you asked Fred, and you said it's better to have a deal and then take that to the partner. How do you even introduce the idea before you even get to that stage? That you just talk to people at the local meetup and just find people you like and say, hey, I'm going to go back to that person if I get a deal. I mean, maybe can you speak to that just initial stage of even meeting those people and vetting them a little bit to make sure this is someone you want to do business with?
Yeah. Well, even before that, step one is really to build some competence in this business. Now, what I learned one of my first deals, I thought it was a good deal. And, I talked to several people about it, and nobody else thought it was a good deal, and they all had money. Well, if people have money, don't think it's a good deal, it's probably not a good deal just because you think it's a good deal. So not every deal is a good deal, and not every try is a home run. You have to swing a few times. But to get back to Fred and finding that first investor, you probably shouldn't even look for an investor until you've bought at least one property, and hopefully more than one, by yourself, and you've got it managed, and you can show somebody what you've done. I bought this house. Here's how much I paid for it. Here's the payments. Here's the income. I manage it. And they can go out and look at it and see it's a real deal and see that you're a real deal. If you've never bought a house before, to go out and tell somebody that they should trust you with their money because you think you can make some money with it, that's an uncomfortable conversation on both sides probably. So step one is develop some competency. And if you can't do it all by yourself, I think maybe your idea of these meetups, if you go to some meeting and you can partner with somebody who's there and maybe you do all the work, but they're looking over your shoulder every step of the way, that may be a way to get started if you've never bought a house before in your life.
And I always talk about
I still encourage people to
and house hacking, it's hard to get that first deal, but I agree with you 100%. If you don't have the competency and the track record to show someone, here's a deal I've done. And that's why I like moving into a house and using your owner occupant loan, or just leasing a house and showing that you subleased it to someone else. I mean, you just got to have there's some way to get your foot in the door with a little bit of skin in the game. And then it just flows so much easier when you're having that second conversation saying, here's my, and I like to I used to make a portfolio where I'd show, here's the one deal I did. Here's 100 before and after pictures. And here's my credit report. And here's my, I try to build up my credibility, but the biggest credibility was that deal that I'd already done. And the fact that I was finding deals and looking for them. And I wholesaled a couple deals. So I think those are, having those quivers in your belt, really make a difference.
I agree. And of course, keeping things local is important. First thing I learned in the real estate business is when you go to sell something, you should go knock on a neighbor's door, because sometimes they want to buy it or they know somebody who wants to buy it. Well, finding investors is kind of the same way. You actually literally can go knock on a door next door sometimes and borrow the money to buy the property you want to buy, because they know they know the value, they know the neighborhood. And the further you get away from that house trying to borrow money physically, if you go to a different town or a different state, and you're trying to borrow money to buy something, those people are much more nervous than the guy next door who really knows the values. And I bought a number of houses and then met neighbors who says to me, if I'd known that house was for sale, I'd have bought it. So people in neighborhoods sometimes are looking for deals, and they don't always get them. If you're the one doing the work and you can get deals under contract, then you win that one. A technique that I used way back and still use to this day, which I like a lot, is a lease option, where I will lease a house with an option to buy it. And that's an excellent way to get your foot in the door here, because you can do this without a lot of cash invested. Typically, I find deals where the people either don't want to manage them, or the property needs some work and they don't want to do the work. Maybe it needs a new roof, or it just needs a rehab and they don't want to do it. And I can see how it can be done simply, So you get that under contract with a lease option, and now you have an option to buy this house at a certain price. And now you start talking to potential investors about this particular house. You can show them all the paperwork, you can show them all the numbers, and sometimes you negotiate a deal where there's some owner financing, or there's a bank loan on there they can take subject to, so they don't have to write a check for the full amount of the house. Most investors, this is probably not a true statement, but a lot of investors, especially the older investors, just want to pay cash. They have the money in the bank. They're not going to go down and get a loan, although most of them could. But people that have enough money in the bank to buy a house for cash are great investors, because they probably have more than that. And to the point you brought up here a little bit ago, you want an investor who how the best way to put this, first of all, who has some money.
That's simple.
It is simple, but it's funny. I've had a number of people who wanted to invest with me, and then when we got down to where the money's coming from, they didn't have it. They had to borrow it from somebody else. They're getting the money from their parents or from somebody else. Well, you don't want to invest with somebody who's borrowing the money from somebody else to give to you, because that puts them under pressure, and they're not under. It's not it's not as safe a deal if they have to pay that money back, and they want to force you to sell the property to pay it back soon. That's a problem for you. Yeah. So make sure they have the money in the bank. Now, they can be a borrower, and when the market is good for borrowing, and my perspective on interest rates may be different than some of your listeners, because I've been doing this long enough to remember interest rates were a lot higher than 7% or 8%. But an investor who could go down to the bank today and borrow money at 8%, and they probably could if they had really good credit, to buy a house with 20% down, could probably make numbers work out. If you can buy the house a little bit below the market and it's in a good neighborhood, and you can buy it with 20% down, the rents will probably more than cover your mortgage payment and taxes, insurance, and maintenance on most houses, that you buy in good neighborhoods. Depends on the price range and where you are, but that formula works. So sometimes you don't have to, if it's a house that's for sale for all cash, or you have a lease option and your terms are cash in maybe 3 years, sometimes you get an investor who will go down and borrow money at the bank. And that was a deal I made with Fred to start with. I would go out and find houses. He had some money, but he wanted to buy quite a few houses, and he didn't have enough money to pay cash for a number of houses. So we would put the contract in Fred's name, and Fred would go down to the bank and he would borrow the money. He'd get an 80% loan, put 20% down, close the deal. And then right after he closed, the house was in his name at that point, and the loan was in his name at that point. But after we closed, we had a deal that he would deed me half interest in that house, and I'd sign the contract and agree to manage that house until we sold it. And then when we sold it, there'd be no commissions to me on either the purchase or the sale. I'm not in the commission business. I'm in a profit business, but I would take half the profit. Now, when you first hear this concept, you might say, well, taking half the profit with nothing invested seems like a lot, and it is a lot. But if you look at the other side of it, when Fred's able to buy that house and make a relatively small down payment, 20% down payment, and I do all the management, and that house, we wouldn't make this deal unless that house had cash flow from day one. We never want to buy a property with an investor that loses money. I mean, from a cash flow standpoint, we always want to have positive cash flow so we don't have to raise more money. But my deal with Fred was always, we split the profit 50-50. That means the cash flow 50-50 after we make the payments and pay all the expenses. And it means the long-term profit 50-50. So if you think through the paperwork on that deal, he had a contract to buy it. I found the house, and I could have assigned the contract to him, but typically I just put it in his name because I would know we were making this deal. Subject to him getting an 80% loan, he'd go down and get the loan, he'd close on it, pay the closing cost, and then I would have a half interest in that house when he would deed me half interest in that house after the closing. And I forgot one little detail here. I would give him a note for half of the money he had invested at that point. So let's say he put $20,000 down. I would give him a note for half of that $20,000 or $10,000 with no payments and no interest until we sold the house. So I wasn't under obligation to make payments to him, and he was giving up the interest on that note. But if you think about what the interest would be on $10,000 or even $50,000 today, if it was, today's numbers, the interest on $50,000 at 6% would be $3,000 a year. He was giving up $3,000 a year in interest. Well, actually half that, because the half the $50,000 would be what my note would be for. So it would be $1,500 in interest, but I was doing all the work. Well, if you could hire me as a manager to find you a deal, to manage it for 10 years until we sold it, and to sell it without a commission for $1,500 a year, that's a good deal for you. Yeah. And of course, every deal we made some money. Some made more than others, but almost all of them made a significant amount of return on his money when he looked back at his investment. And actually, we owned all those houses until Fred died. We never sold a single house. Wow. And that brings up an interesting point, because when Fred died, his wife, Mary, became my investor, and she was happy. She just wanted the cash flow. So I kept managing them, because by then all the houses were paid for. And then when Mary died, guess who ended up with them?
Her kids.
The kids. And what did the kids want?
They wanted cash.
What do you think?
They wanted the cash.
They wanted
pay
cash.
Me, John. Pay me my cash.
They didn't want that cash flow every month. And here is, if you don't know this, it's a really important part of the tax law. My kids just figured this out. But when you inherit something, you get a stepped up basis, which means they appraise the properties and they value the properties based on what they're worth the date that the person who owned them died, and whoever inherits them can sell them for that price and not pay any taxes. Well, that's a heck of a deal. That's a heck of a deal. So when the kids inherited the houses, and let's just make it simple. Let's say we had 6 houses at that time. I had a conversation with them, and I said, I really don't want to sell, but here's what we'll do. We'll take 3 of the houses and we'll sell them, and you get all the cash for those 3, and I get to keep the other 3. And we did a 1031 exchange for my half interest in half the houses, and their half interest in the other half of the houses. So they took all their money out tax free, and I still own the houses, the other houses. So it worked out really well.
So many interesting things I want to dig into. Let's just, if you don't mind, go into some of the details. And I love how you went all the way to the exit strategy, because one of my questions was going to be, when you're planning a deal like this, a lot of people talk about short-term partnerships, but what's really interesting is you've done this over many decades. I've done the same thing. I've had 4 or 5 investors for decades now. And so to me, it validates some of the idea of, is this a fair deal? Is it fair to you as the entrepreneur? You bought a property with none of your own cash. You were able to buy a property with more safety, which I don't think we talked about earlier. But for me as a young investor, one of the things I was really concerned about was running out of money. I was afraid I was going to crash and burn because I invested right into the teeth of the 2008, 9, and 10 recession. And if I had not had private partners and private lenders who had a lot more liquidity than I did, had a lot more reserves, I don't think hopefully I would have made it, but I made it through that because of these partnerships and private lender relationships that I had. So I just want to emphasize that as the entrepreneur, not only is it where you get into with less money, but you're attaching your destiny to someone who has much better cash position than you do, which is a really smart thing, because that's going to get you through that really difficult period of growth where you're going to be cash tight. And so I always tell people, I've been trying to think of a name for this. I'm calling it the pumpkin pie principle, because I love pumpkin pie. And if I'm not going to eat any pumpkin pie because I have no money, why not give half of my pumpkin pie to a partner? And then now I get to eat my pumpkin pie and I'm having some food. So that's the way. Partnerships to me are they're just the idea of sharing the deal you have, the pumpkin pie you have, and both of you get to eat, and both of you get a benefit that you would have not received otherwise.
Well, absolutely. And Fred, as I said, he was about retirement age, early retirement, but probably early 60s. He didn't want to work. He had some money in the bank. He had retirement income. He wasn't interested in going out and managing tenants. And, he'd heard all the bad stories. And I knew the truth. I knew that I could manage these tenants without a lot of problems on my part, because I know how to manage. So it worked out really well. And we took that same formula and dealt with other folks and structured different types of deals. For example, I had one house that we could buy. It was a very nice house that we could buy for about 60 cents on the dollar, but it had to be cash. It was a foreclosure sale. So I found an investor. It wasn't Fred, it was somebody else who had put up the money for that house. And they owned the house in their name, free and clear. So they paid, let's just use round numbers. It's a $400,000 house, and they bought it for $240,000, but they paid cash for it. And, when there are tough times like we had 12 years ago, there are foreclosures, and the foreclosures sell at significant discounts. And especially the little higher priced houses. There's more competition for the lower price houses in the foreclosure market than there is the higher price houses, because most people don't want to rent a higher priced house. So we would shop markets a little out of most people's price ranges and get bigger discounts. So long story short, he bought the house for cash. I knew we couldn't sell it right away because we were in a recession. The best thing to do was to hold on to it for 5 or 10 years till it grew up. So I leased it from him with an option to buy half interest. So using those numbers, if he paid $240,000 for it, my option was to buy half interest in that house for $120,000. And in the meantime, I gave him about a 5% return on his money. So he was getting about $1,000 a month rent, and I was able to rent it to somebody else for more money. So I was making a profit on the rent, and I had an option to buy this house at a very good price, and everybody understood the deal. It's kind of restates the point that everybody, if they've owned real estate before and they understand the business and they understand you can't sell it right away, especially in a recession, and it wouldn't be smart. If we bought it for $240 and sold it for $260, that wouldn't be smart, because we knew the house was going to be worth $400,000 or $500,000 when the market turned around. So you're looking for somebody who has this longer term outlook. And most people who have that kind of money sitting in a bank, $240,000 in the bank, are earning something, or if they have in the stock market or in T-bills or money market accounts, they're getting some kind of return. So typically they're looking for some kind of cash flow. But if you can buy something at a deep enough discount, it's easy to structure a deal that pays the taxes and the insurance and gives them some cash flow, and yet leaves you enough room to make a nice profit on the rent to somebody else. Yeah, or you might even just move into a house like that.
Exactly. Yeah. I was going to say, one of the criteria I learned from your book and your courses as well, early on in my career, every house I looked at, even though I didn't have the cash, I would look at it as if it were my cash. And I said, okay, if I had somebody who had $240,000 in cash, what would they want to see if they bought that deal? And, listening to Warren Buffett and other people, first of all, they want safety. They want to know that their money's not going to disappear. So let's give them either the deed to the house or a first mortgage, or first deed of trust, or so they're the most secure position. And then let's get them some kind of cash flow. So you mentioned 5%. I would actually look at every deal and say, if I paid cash for this, what kind of cash return, what kind of cap rate or unleveraged yield would this property produce? And if it produced 5%, I was able to pay that 5% to the investor safely, knowing that this property would produce it. And then if I took care of those two things, the safety of the investor and the income for the investor, now we have some time, we have some patience to be able to wait on the upside. And so that was a really important unlock for me, with putting myself in the shoes of the investor, this person who has the money, trying to think about what their perspective is. And to that point, I want to go, if you don't mind, you've mentioned two different kinds of deals. And I think people are getting kind of the concept here. You buy a property with an investor. There's a lot of benefits to that for both the investor and the entrepreneur. I want to dig into some of the details of how you structured it, because there's multiple ways you could do this. You mentioned a concept that I think might have gone over some people's head, or they might have been wondering about it, saying your partner deeded half interest to you. So they owned the property in the beginning, and then they deeded half interest to you. Can you talk about, I know behind the scenes what kind of deed that was, but I'm hoping you could explain why you did that, and not, for example, some people do a partnership and they just start an LLC and the two of them own the property in one LLC. Maybe you could compare and contrast that, what you did, and is that something you would do again today?
Yes. Well, a couple of things with partnerships. They don't all work out. Okay. And when I say partnerships, that's really a legal term that talks about structuring a business entity, and both partners have some responsibilities. For example, if you and I are partners and we tell the world we're partners, and I go down and sign a contract in our partnership name, you're bound by it. And if I go borrow some money, you're bound by it. And if I sign a contract to put a roof on, you're bound by it, because you're my partner. And if I don't pay the bills, they're going to come to talk to you. So it's not a term that you want to use unless you really understand the legal concept of partnerships. And most people will tell you not to form a partnership because you do have this cross liability with your partner. A very simple reason I didn't want to have partnerships is I didn't want to have my tax return tied to somebody else's tax return and have them get audited and then have them come see me because we are partners, right? So I don't like relationships that tie me to the other person in a negative way. I want them in a positive way. So if you and I are buying this house together, and you go down to the bank and you borrow the money, and the property now is in your name, okay, and the loan is in your name, and then you deed me an undivided half interest. We're tenants in common at this point, which means I own half interest in this house and you own half interest in this house. But if you die, your half interest goes to your heirs. If I die, it goes to my heirs. If somebody sues you, they can make a claim against your half interest, but not mine. If somebody sues me, they can make a claim against my half interest, but not yours. So even though we own this thing 50-50, it's like, it kind of reminds me of one of my first properties I bought. I bought with a good friend of mine, and it was a duplex, and he lived upstairs and I lived downstairs. And we own the thing. It's tenants in common, 50-50. But I had a little handshake agreement. But anything that broke upstairs, he'd fix, and downstairs, I'd fix. But if the roof broke, we both get to fix it. But you can divide things up that way where you don't have this cross liability. So when you form an entity like an LLC or a corporation, the first thing you should do is worry about the one entity that you can't escape, and that's the IRS. Taxes are something you just can't negotiate away, and they are a liability that'll always be with you. So the tax boys are always going to be chasing you if you do something stupid from an entity standpoint. When you own something as tenants in common, that's the simplest way to do things. But there's nothing wrong with LLCs. There is something wrong with corporations. If you own property in a corporation, you need to have an accountant. Your talk with your accountant to talk about what's going to happen when you sell the property. What can you avoid double taxation when you sell the property? So I don't want to get deep into that subject, but if you want to use an LLC or a trust, it's both very legitimate ways to own properties, and you end up filing a tax return in that entity typically, unless it's a single member. But if you're going to own it with somebody else, there's going to be two members. So again, get good accounting advice and understand how it works before you do it. I prefer to keep things as simple as possible. And so the two ways that are simple, number one is to own things like I just discussed as tenants in common. And the other way, if you don't even want me involved in the title ownership for some reason, the lease option works really well, because now the whole property is in your name and I have an option to buy it. And if this deal doesn't work somehow, if I get in trouble and I can't exercise my option, or things happen in life, well, you still own that house and you own it all by yourself. So you're protected. Now you have title insurance, you have insurance on the house. You're not going to lose your money. And as you point out, when somebody invests with you, even though you may have 100% confidence in yourself, they're probably a little nervous about you until they get to know each other a little bit better and things go well, and after years, maybe things work out. But the first year or two, probably everybody's a little bit nervous. So you want to protect them in every way.
Well,
that help?
It does help. Yeah. And even I'm going to say it in my own words, just to make sure I got it right, and maybe other people got it right too. If you buy a property as tenants in common, then it's a simple language on a deed. Is that correct? So when you transfer the title to a property, there's different ways you can transfer the title, but a competent real estate attorney in whatever state you're in, it's not going to be a foreign concept to be able to deed a property as tenants in common. That's my understanding. And most attorneys I've talked to in my state, that's been a very common thing. And the lease option concept, I think sometimes people overthink that as well, is in the deal you talked about where you buy a $240,000 property and your investor pays cash for it. They own 100% of the property. And maybe I'm trying to think of a scenario that I did in my past where I had an investor who was doing a 1031 exchange from another property, and they sold that property. They didn't want to pay taxes on it. And they said, "Hey, Chad, do you have a deal I can buy?" I said, "Well, I happen to have a deal under contract right now." I let them buy the equivalent of that $240,000 property for cash. And then they owned 100% of it in that case. And then they just leased it to me with an option to buy half interest in the property, just as you described. And so I just want to point out that they're very similar in that eventually, if I have an option on the property, I can eventually own it as a 50-50 tenants in common. So just like John described, but I have a contract to do that. I haven't done it yet. I have the option to do it. And options I've learned a lot about options from you as well. They're one of my favorite ways to invest in real estate, because there's so many, they're so misunderstood. They're so little used. And yet I've basically controlled almost the same thing. There's some nuanced differences there, but I've controlled the upside of the property. I've got cash flow on the property, almost all the benefits that I would have had owning it. I've still got that as having a lease option. And it's just another tool that allows me to customize the situation for my investor and still get the deal done.
And a third way to split profits, of course, is with a loan. If you're the investor and I find a house to buy, I can go to you and just borrow the money and say, "Look, Chad, I'll pay you so much." The problem with this is twofold. Number one is, if I say I'll pay you, we agree on 10% interest today. And just because the banks are charging investors 8 doesn't mean that you're going to lend it to me at 8. You're probably going to want a little bit more. And then now I have an obligation to make these payments to you, and they're high payments. So it's really going to suck up all the cash flow in this property for a while, probably. And the second thing, and the reason you're charging me a little higher interest rate probably is that you're not participating in the appreciation. If I borrow the money from you, I own 100% of the house. So now if the house doubles in 10 years, I get to keep the double part. You just get your 10%. And people understand that. They may not be able to tell you that, but that's what they're thinking. They're thinking, if I'm not getting any appreciation and we're going to have inflation, my money's going to be worth less in 10 years than it is today. I need to charge a little higher interest rate. That's just the way the world works. Yeah. So I would always rather split profits than I would borrow money at a rate like that, because it's cheaper, and it's safer. It's safer for me. I'd rather have a lower profit, but maybe potential for a higher profit, than I would borrow the money and own 100% of the property and take that risk, especially in a down market. Now, when I do borrow money, typically I'm borrowing money on property I already own, not property that I want to buy. So if you're my investor and I find a property that I can buy at a really great price, and so I don't really want to share it with you, I now might go to you and say, look, I've got these 5 houses I already own, Chad. If you'll loan me $100,000 against these 5 houses, I'll give them all to you as collateral. If you give me a really good interest rate, it's a really safe deal. You can't lose your money. And by over collateralizing, by giving somebody almost 100% safety, if there is such a thing, then you can negotiate a lower interest rate. And I've done that with a number of investors over the years who've loaned me money at actually below market rents. Right now, I'm paying less than 5% on most of my loans. Because of 2 things. Number one, they know they're going to get their money back. And number 2, they know I'll probably find a deal that I'll split with them down the road, and they'll make money on both sides. So a couple of different ways.
It's like a farm system, both for you and the investor. You have those 4 or 5 investors you work with. They do some loans, they do some partnership deals. And for you, you're able to consistently get the money on your deals when you don't have the money, and you're not having to just pass on a deal. You know that at a minimum, you're going to get half the deal. Maybe you get all of it if it's a really good deal. And so you keep moving forward because you have the money available. You're not having to sit there and wait.
And here's something you need to think about. And even in the worst recession ever, some people have money. During the Great Depression, some people had money. And when real estate prices get to be their lowest, the most attractive, that's when private money is so important, because the banks will quit lending money to investors. And if you haven't seen that part of the cycle yet, you probably will in the next few years, where banks get in trouble. They right now have a lot of commercial loans that aren't paying them, a lot of apartment building loans, a lot of commercial property loans. So there's a chances that the banks will pull back on their lending on residential too. They haven't done it yet, but they might. And when they do that, then if nobody can go to the bank and get a loan to buy a house, that's when that private money becomes very, very valuable. And that's when the cost goes up. People are not happy with 7% if they know they can make 20% someplace. So, but if you've got an established relationship with people, you've got the inside track on some of that money.
You got to line it up ahead of time, because when the deals are available, it's usually a short window or relatively short window, and there's an inverse relationship. The less money that's available with banks, the better the prices are, because there aren't as many buyers for properties. So that's what we found out in 2008, 9, and 10 as well. I love it. So I want to go into a couple more nitpicky details. I know I always get these questions in the comments on YouTube. When I do a joint venture, or when I have a 50% ownership, as a tenant said, comment with somebody's put the money up. Some of the details that might come up are, you've already mentioned any expenses in the future. So if we have a heating air that costs $8,000, I'm assuming we just split that 50-50. Is that the way you would do it with your Fred kind of deal?
That's always been my deal. And so that makes you a little more particular about what you buy. You're not likely to buy something that's going to need major fix up or major rehab if you're going to have to put up half the money. So there's 2 ways to look at that. You can have the investor buy it and get it rehab first and then buy into the deal. Or you can simply look for a house that doesn't need rehabbing. It's already in good shape. And I bought 18 or 20 brand new houses, and those have been great investor deals because they were brand new, new roofs, new everything. So we knew that we probably had at least 10 years without any serious maintenance. And those are wise deals. And the last few deals I bought have been totally rehabbed. Somebody else has bought them, and they're intended on flipping them, but they didn't get it flipped, and they've done a nice rehab. You have to make sure it's a nice rehab. If you've seen rehabs, they're not all the same.
Yes, I agree.
If they've done a good job on the rehab, then that's a good property for an investor, because you're not going to put more money into it right away.
My understanding of your strategy, John, is that the flipper, the rehabber, the BRRRR strategy, people are trying to buy properties that they can buy 70 cents on the dollar, even less. Sometimes you'd be willing to pay a little bit more than that, maybe 75, 80%, but get a quality property that's in your location that you can hold for a long time. It's the old Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, buy a quality property at a reasonable price instead of buying not that great of a property at an amazing price. You're buying a quality property at a quality location. It's a good deal, but it might not be the home run today, but over the long run, you make a lot of money on those. And it's also a good return on your time. You're not having to spend all your time fixing it up and managing the project and doing all that work.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to manage a house that doesn't need work than one that has to be rehabbed. No question about it.
All right, some other nitpicky questions. So you have this joint venture with your money partner. How do you deal with cash that accumulates and also with cash reserves? Because I know it's something for me. I always like to have at least a certain amount of money set aside for emergencies, for things like that. Do you just open up a bank account that the two of you have access to, and then agree that you'll build up a cash reserve at that point? And then from there, when do you distribute the money? I'm just curious about the cash in, cash out type side of things.
Yeah, no, I set up a separate account for each ownership, not necessarily for each property, but let's say you and I own 3 houses together, we would have one account for those 3 houses. And I manage that account. I'm the one that makes the deposits to that account. I'm the one that writes the checks out of that account. And what I've always done was once a year, we furnish an accounting. I'm not going to do it every month. I'm not going to go through that kind of detail. And once a year, we split up the money. And typically, there's not a lot of money to split up the first couple of years, but sometimes there is. I mean, I have one investor. I just bought this one out, but she was getting $24,000 a year. But I would write that check once a year. I'd write it, at the end of December after all the dust had cleared. Now that doesn't leave me with any reserves, so you're a little nervous the first week in January, but after you get another couple months rent in the bank, you're in pretty good shape. And if you're going to put a roof on in January, you might want to do that in December anyway. Take it out of last year's for tax reasons and because you have the cash to do it. So you do everything you can that's smart. It's not a perfect system, but I don't want to get in a position where I'm making monthly reports and monthly payments to people. It's just too much work on my side. And I tell them that going in up front. So if it is a deal like the lease option deal we've talked about, where they're putting up $240,000 and they're getting a check each month for rent. Now I'm sending them a check for rent each month. I mean, they are getting a monthly check on that type of deal where they put up that kind of cash. But if somebody gets into a house with $20 or $30 or $40,000 down, they shouldn't expect much cash flow. There's not going to be much cash flow from that house for a number of years. There'll be some, hopefully, but not a lot. And we can make those distributions once a year. Just to keep it simple, but it's a separate account, and it's not an account they sign on. It's just an account I sign on, and it's generally in some entity, an LLC or a sub-S or something.
Yeah, that's not something we mentioned earlier, but we talked about owning 50-50 of a property, but each of you could have your own LLC that owns your 50% interest, which would probably be what a lot of attorneys would recommend. Having your money partner has their LLC, you've got your LLC, and then you have your bank account for the LLC.
It comes down to control. If I'm going to invest with anybody, I want to have control. I'm kind of a little bit of a control freak, I guess, but I don't want to have to call you and say, do you like this tenant? Or I don't have to call you and say, do you think we should put a new air conditioner in? I want to make those decisions myself. And that's part of why you're in this deal, is because I'm not going to bother you with those kind of decisions. I'm just going to make them and get it done. So on the other hand, I don't want to set up a situation where I have to ask you. I don't want to be in a corporation where it's a 50-50 stock ownership or something, and we have to vote on things to get them done. So don't create an entity that's going to cause you to lose control of making day-to-day decisions, who you rent to, even when you sell. I own property with other people, and they have an option to buy interest in my property, but I own it. So I get to make a decision when to sell, and I make a decision how much to sell it for, and whether to carry terms or not. I can make all those decisions without even consulting to the people that have an option to buy in.
Yeah. So that's my next question as well about decisions. And you mentioned earlier that the strategy up front is to hold the property until it doubles in value, for example. That's a nice, clear objective,
At least
a
once.
clear time frame.
Mhm.
Do you put that in some sort of tenants in common agreement? Do you have like a joint venture agreement, or is this just more like old school? Hey, we both know that that's what we're going to do.
Well, here's the practical side of that. If you and I own a house as tenants in common and you decide to sell, you can only sell your half. You can't sell my half. So without my permission, this deal doesn't go together. So I would agree in a writing. It probably would not be a contract. It would be actionable, but I would agree in writing if you wanted me to that we 10 years from now or when the house doubles. I wouldn't say 10 years from now. I'd say when the house doubles in value, we'll get together and make a joint decision on whether to keep it or sell it. But that's about as detailed as it's going to get.
Yeah, I think the unwritten assumption that I'm hearing, which I really like, is that there's trust in these relationships. That you get so many of these. I looked into kind of syndication investing, and I ran away from it. Just wasn't really interested in it. A lot of the unwritten assumption there is that you have 100 pages of documents because we don't trust each other, and we have to, and nobody knows each other either, and so we have to think of every single thing that's going to go wrong. And that's smart to do in a partnership. I understand that. But the kind of business that you're doing, the kind of business I've done with my private lenders has been long-term relationships where if I screwed you over, I'm screwing myself. And I want to do business with you for the next decades and not just the next year or two. And it's just a different, it's a different form of business. And it's kind of a little bit of an old school, small town type of business. I call it the small, mighty investor. But I find it so refreshing. Not that you pass up on contracts. I still sign contracts and do that, but there's just a different level of dialogue, a different level of relationship where my investor, they trust me to do what I said I was going to do. And I follow up and our interests are aligned. And I think it's a pretty refreshing way to do business that maybe people aren't as familiar with out there. There's a lot of other ways that are not quite as refreshing.
Well, what you'll find with experience is if you have a contract and people don't agree, now you get to go hire a lawyer and go to the judge and see what the agreement really is. If you and I have a contract, but then you won't perform or I won't perform or we get in a fight, now you get lawyers involved. I tried to avoid that part. I've never been in a fight with any of my investors. I've always tried to structure deals so that if there is a problem, we can solve it amicably, and sometimes you end up buying an investor out. I've had investors. I had one fella get divorced. That's not unusual. I had one of my earliest guys. He was one of my real estate salesmen. And this guy, I just misread him totally, but I borrowed some money from him and we didn't own the property together. But he fell in love with somebody other than his wife, and then they embezzled some money from her boss and he went to jail. I said, good grief, how wrong could this go? Now, fortunately, we were not on title together, I had borrowed money from him. But if I owned property with him in a partnership, it'd have been a disaster because I wouldn't be able to get him to sign things, If I own things 50-50, if you and I own things 50-50, tenants in common, and you want to sell your interest, probably the only person you can actually sell that interest to and get any place close to retail is me. So, I'm happy to buy out investors. And I've done that, whenever somebody wants out, I said, well, give me some time. And what we'll end up doing is, if we're not going to sell the property we own together, I'll sell something else and I'll 1031 into your half. And I've done that over and over again. And actually, we're just about to close on our last transaction. My last investor I'm buying out this year. And we're waiting for a property to sell, and we'll 1031 their share out because most of my investors are older. They don't wait 20 more years, and they don't need to. They don't need to have it double again. It's doubled plenty of times. They're doing just fine.
You said that twice,
but don't get them in a position where you have to hire a lawyer to make the deal work. If you have it set up where you'll never need a lawyer, you'll be happy.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, love that philosophy. You've mentioned a very specific thing that I'm going to dig into one more time before we close. You had another benefit of this tenants in common ownership is that you can do a 1031 exchange on the other portion, which is just fascinating to me because we often think about you got to go find another property. So what you just said was you own half of this property, and then you sold another property, and you were able to 1031 into that 50% interest that the other person owned. So that is one way. So essentially, after you do that, you now own 100% of the property, no partners, and you've gone from two properties to one property, less maintenance, less management. I don't know that I have a question about that. I think that's another, the flexibility you mentioned of taxes is one of the most important entity structure questions you should ask yourself. And I find that to be a really compelling concept, not only for you as the entrepreneur, but also for the investor, because if you own that property together in an LLC, you'd have to decide together to sell the property, and you could either had to do a 1031 or you didn't, because you own the property together. Whereas when you own tenants in common, you can make separate decisions, and that's just a really flexible tool for you for long term.
And that same thing is true. Same thing is true with partnerships and corporations. So that's why, I'm always tickled when somebody calls me up and they haven't bought a house yet and they want to swarm a corporation. I said, no, buy the house first. You can always put it into a corporation, but if you buy the house in the corporation and find you made a mistake, now you've got a problem. You know me pretty well, but I do my best to keep things as simple as possible. Life is complicated enough already without making my investment life more complicated. So I don't go layer on layer on layer trying to hide from somebody. I buy houses that attract good tenants. I've never had a tenant sue me. We maintain the houses, keep them in good shape, so never had a problem because of that. Keep your business small enough that you can control it. And my philosophy, most people don't need a lot of houses. I just talked to one of my students that has 2 houses, and they're happy as a clam. They're done. He's 65 years old and he's done with 2 houses. He's making $5,000 a month off those 2 houses, and that's all he wants. So, you don't need to build an empire here, and everybody has different goals, but keeping things simple in the long run will make you probably happier. You have time to do other stuff that's more fun.
One of the most important messages that we can all hear. So I love that. John, is there anything else that I haven't asked you would say about partnerships? This has been kind of like a masterclass in partnerships. So I appreciate you letting me dig into the details and ask the questions that maybe people haven't heard before. Is there anything that we missed, or other maybe just mistakes that people need to think about before they do a partnership?
You can listen to this podcast more than once, but I've recorded 3 different courses you might want to study. And one is on making money with investors. You can get on my website and look at all these courses, making money with investors. One is buying and selling with lease options. And the third one is just straight options. Now that's more of an advanced course. And you really don't need that one until you get to the point where you just don't want any more real estate, but you want to continue to invest. So that's what it's for. It's really for people to have pension plan money and want to invest, but they don't want to own real estate. So, but learn as much as you can. If you don't know how to manage, I've got a great course on landlording, single family landlording, and all these are on my website. So you can look at them. But you can't get too good at this business. And the fun thing about this business is you do continue to learn. I was giving a speech the other day and I said, what I did this morning? 8:30 this morning, I got up and took a tennis lesson. That's not because I don't know how to play tennis. I've been playing tennis for 50 years, but because I learn something every time I take a tennis lesson. And if you're in the real estate business, you should take lessons. You should study this, not just go out and try to make it up. There's a lot of people who have studied this business, who really understand it, and you can learn from them. So learn from people who have gone before you, and try to avoid making big mistakes. And especially if you're going to invest with other people, you're asking them to trust you with their money, and that's a big deal. That's a big deal. I'll tell you one story kind of to wrap up here. I borrowed money from one of my investors here a couple of years ago during the downturn, and I bought this house for $265,000, and we thought we were going to sell it. We had somebody that wanted to buy it right away. So we had it under contract for about $310,000, I think, right away, and it fell through because the market had just started to change. And then we ended up selling it for $140,000 a couple of years later. Well, I didn't call my investor up and say, you lost $120,000. I ate that loss. I paid him that $120,000, and because he trusted me with that money, and it wasn't, he wasn't investing it with me hoping to make a profit. He wanted to make sure he got his money back. So you have to understand that people trust you with money. They want that money back, and it's important that you give them back. Even if it hurts, that you get that money back to them. So the deals you make, again, all the stuff we talked about today, long-term quality properties you know how to manage. If you do all that, you're not going to have many losses. But if you're trying to buy and sell something in a hurry, you could get caught in a bad market.
Wonderful lesson to wrap up on, John. I'm going to put links to all those courses. By the way, I've been a student of John's for 21 years now, so this is going to be the best courses you could take on the subject. I'm also going to plug your book, John, the Building Wealth One House at a Time is my go-to book. It's one that I recommend for anybody, whether you're a new investor, long-term investor. And there's a new edition of it, so I don't know if you want to make any comments about that, but I've got it on my shelf, and I've read it again and made notes in it. So just want to give you the opportunity to plug that as well.
Well, I've been very fortunate to be able to be in a business where I can help other people invest well, and made a lot of friends doing it. And I always encourage people, if I've signed your book, I've always said, build wealth, enjoy it, and then share it. Share your knowledge with other people, and share your money. Giving money away is a fun part of life. So get in a position where you can give money away and be happy about it.
Thank you for your time, John. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Chad. Always.
In this episode, we learned how to find the money for your real estate deals through partnerships. But you might be asking yourself, how do you find the right property and analyze it before you bring it to your partner? So in my next episode, another interview with John Schaub, we talk about how to find the best rental properties and how to make them cash flow in any economy. If you're watching on YouTube, there'll be a link above me here and also in the YouTube description or the podcast description below.